Hello and welcome to this second screencast on practice. So if we just look at the specification again, and this is what we've come up to so far with regards to our learning. We've done classification of skill, stages of learning, types of guidance, and last lesson, we looked at practice types. We looked at the four first practice types, which were part practice, whole part, whole practice, and progressive part practice. Now what we're aiming to look at is the next four. Okay, so now we're looking at massed practice, distributed practice, fixed practice, and varied practice. Now, it's the same applies with regards to having to know the characteristics and uses of each. So we have to be able to describe each one and give an example. Then we need to be able to move up and describe the uses that make the practice type so effective. And we're looking at the key kind of discriminators again. We're looking at ability and classification of skill. Whenever we're talking about the type of practice we are going to perform for a person to learn a skill, we have to be able to do it appropriately towards their ability and the classification of skill we are doing. If you do not pick the right practice type for their ability or the classification of skill, it's not going to work. Okay, so hopefully we have in mind ability and classification as we go through these practice types. So examples of potential questions with regards to these practice types, fixed and so on. We've got define fixed practice and give an example of a skill for which it would be suitable. And then at the bottom we've got here, explain when each of massed, distributed, fixed and varied practice methods could be used to improve the performance of a movement skill. So remember there, or not remember, but with regards to that question, it's not asking for a definition or a description. It's basically saying which skills would they be best for, and that's what we're going to be going through during today's screencast and then in the lesson as well. And don't forget, we had the other two questions that potentially could come up with regards to whole part, whole practice, part practice, and part progressive practice. You'd have to compare as well. So part and whole, or whole and part of part. And today we're looking at the other types of practice. So to begin with, characteristics and uses of massed practice. Okay, so massed practice, look at the pictures that we've got there. Hopefully that is going to start kind of making you think of the type of classification of skill massed practice might be useful for. So what is massed practice? It is continuous practice with very few rest intervals. Okay, so practicing en masse, however, you can't say that. We have to be able to use the terminology that is down in front of you there. So it's continuous practice with very few rest intervals. For example, a free throw in basketball. We need to be able to determine what mass practice is effective for, or why is it effective, and what it's not effective for. So what classification of skills, what ability levels this is potentially effective for. So mass practice, first of all, we're talking about the effectiveness of mass practice. We need to look at this motor program and grooving. Now, motor programs are movement plans, okay, in your brain or in our brains that are produced, and these are really good at grooving, okay, and mass practice is really good. This term grooving is really important, okay, so it becomes habitual. So it's really good at creating these movement patterns in our brain so that they become grooved. Okay, so mass practice is continuous practice with very few rest intervals, really develops these motor programs and grooving. It's really important, or it's very good for autonomous performers that are highly motivated. Okay, being able to perform for a long period of time without resting, you're going to have to be motivated for that. So it's really good for high ability autonomous performers that are highly motivated. That is why they become so good at what they do, because they're so motivated that they continually practice without any rests or very few rest intervals. Types of, or the classification of skills that mass practice is really good for are simple skills, okay, so low decision making. It's not really tiring in terms of our decision making. Discrete skills, there's a clear end, okay, so discrete member is clear beginning and end. We're focusing on the end here, so it's quick, it's over quickly. So free throw shots, you're doing it repeatedly without any rest, but it's over very quickly. If it didn't end, you'd get certain issues with that. And finally, it's also very good for closed skills that are not affected by the environment. If we're looking at kind of where mass practice is not so effective, it's not effective for dangerous skills, okay? In terms of dangerous skills, what I'm thinking about is because you're continually practicing without any rest, it's going to increase the risk of fatigue, therefore injury, okay? So it's really important it's not used for dangerous skills due to the fact that you're going to become fatigued and injure easily. And it can also be very demotivating, okay? So constant repetition of this can become very boring and demotivating. So that is something that we need to be aware of for mass practice. So make sure you've got all that information down. You've got questions for each point, and we'll move on to distributed practice. So distributed practice is bursts of practice with rest intervals. So it's actually the opposite to mass practice, okay? So mass practice, very limited rest intervals. Distributed practice, bursts of practice with rest intervals. E.g., sprinting or a sprint start in running. Okay, so it's really good for exercise that is going to cause potential fatigue. Now, I've got at the bottom distributed, disrupted. We're going to come back to that later on this slide. So, what is it effective for? Distributed practice. So, this bursts of practice with rest intervals. It's effective for low ability cognitive performers. Okay, so these rest periods that have this allows that mental rehearsal. If we look back to stages of learning, the cognitive learner needs to create a mental picture. So it's really good for our cognitive learners who need that mental rehearsal, that mental picture. It's really good for feedback from the coach. Again, if we go back to the cognitive stages of learning, feedback is really important extrinsically for the cognitive learner, i.e. from the coach. And it's also good for skills that you need to recover from because you could potentially become tired. So you distribute it, you disrupt it with rest intervals. So as I said earlier on, good for complex skills, i.e. to give the brain a rest. If there's a lot of decision making, perceptual load, it's really important to have that break. It's good for continuous exercise as well as gross. Okay, I'm going to come back to gross skills when it comes to tiring. Okay, so if you're using large muscle groups, you're going to become tired very quickly, fatigued. Therefore, it's important you have these rest intervals. Okay, so it's not effective. It disrupts the fluidity of the skill. So this distributed equals disrupted. Distributed practice does disrupt the practice with these rest intervals, these breaks. Therefore, you don't get enough time to get into the flow and the fluidity of learning a skill. So whether or not you've ever been in a training session before where the coach kept stopping the drill or kept stopping the session, you're just like, let me just get on with it. You're disrupting my flow here, my fluidity. So it disrupts fluidity. Distributed, okay, distributed, disrupted. Disrupted is not good for fluidity. And then also breaks can be too long, which again leads to potential demotivation as well. So it's not very motivating, constantly breaking. You start to get a bit demotivated by this as the performer. So that is distributed practice. Distributed and mass practice, very much kind of like the opposites of each other. Then we move on to fixed practice. So fixed practice are conditions or practice conditions that are stable. Think of fixed, something that is fixed is stable. Okay, and it's predictable. Really good for our shot put. So in front of you got discus throw and hammer throw. Really good for the shot put as well. Shot put is an example we've used often with regards to classification of skills. If we look at fixed practice, we look at what it's effective for. It's really effective for overlearning and grooving skills. Okay, so there's no environmental pressure, no environmental change here, so it allows us to overlearn and groove the skill. Okay, the conditions are completely stable, nothing changes, therefore it's really important, it's really good to overlearn the skill within this. And as I've said there, it also gets us in the groove of the skill as well. This is really good for our cognitive performers, low ability cognitive performers, and shot put being the example. Hopefully that kind of makes you think with regards to classification of skills. We're thinking of closed skills. Okay, remember, fixed, stable, predictable, it's not changing, therefore closed skills are not affected by the environment. Self-paced skills and discrete skills where there's a clear beginning and end. And for with regards to where fixed practice is not effective, it is not effective because it's demotivating, and also it's not good for high ability learners either because the predictability becomes demotivating. And finally, if it's not good for closed skills, or it's good for closed skills, sorry, it's not going to be great for open skills because open skills are affected by the environment. Therefore, a practice condition that is stable and predictable, you don't get that open skill environment, i.e. the environment changing, so it's not good for open skills. Finally, varied practice conditions that are constantly changing, that are unpredictable. So fixed and varied are very much opposites of each other. I've got examples there of passing in netball, football goalkeeper, dribbling in hockey. We can also think of a 5v3 possession game where there is constant unpredictability. The environment is constantly changing during that 5v3 possession game. So who is this effective for? Who is it not effective for? So it's effective for high ability autonomous performers. If we think about that environment constantly changing, the information processing that we're going to get from that. So we've got it replicates information processing with game situations. This is really important. Okay, we get this positive transfer now from the actual skill that we're learning to the actual game. Now it's completely non-game like doing a fixed practice that is closed if it's to do with an open skill. And fixed practice is really good for free throws, for example. Mass practice is really good for free throws. However, varied practice is good for this in-game play where this information processing needs to be developed, because you are constantly seeing during a 5v3 in training different things. Okay, with regards to our information processing, we get better at doing that. Now with this as well, it's really good for open skills. Complex skills, where complex, we know it's to do with information processing and that high perceptual load, that high decision making, and externally paced skills. A 5v3 possession game is completely externally paced with regards to when you're receiving a ball, when you pass a ball. Finally, we have this thing called schema. Schema is really important. Okay, so varied practice develops schema. These are where our generalized motor programs that we have in our brain. This allows us to adapt to different situations. Developing these schemas are producing these motor programs. Schema are these motor programs that we develop in our head. If we can develop schema, we're developing these motor programs in our brain. This allows us to adapt to different situations within the actual game. So schema is really important. Now, in terms of who varied practice is not effective for, or what it's not effective for, it's not great for low ability cognitive learners, and as it confuses them. Mistakes I've made in the past, I've done a lot of 5v3s, 4v3s, 5v5, 6v6, 6v4, 6v3s in training when I coach hockey, where the environment is always changing. We've got this varied practice going on. It's unpredictable. If you have people that have just started playing, you can see the confusion in their faces. They don't know where they're going. They get confused. They just don't enjoy it at all. So varied practice, this unpredictability, is not good for cognitive learners. It's also not great for closed skills that are not affected by the environment. If we think back to our classifications of skills, which makes sense. Varied practice is unpredictable. The environment is constantly changing. Closed skills, we don't have the environment changing, therefore we don't need to practice in that way. So they are the different types of practice that we need to learn for our next lesson. Please ensure you have good solid notes on this. You understand the descriptions of each one: varied, fixed, mass distributed. You have the description for each one, or definition for each one, and you have an example. Then we really need to get used to now knowing what each practice type, or who each practice type is effective for, what it's not effective for. I'll help you out with memory methods within the lesson. However, just get that down for now with key questions. Thank you.